Hello and welcome to everyone on the line. We're so glad you could join us for today's webinar, Inventory to Cash Optimization. This event was organized by the United States Fashion Industry Association, representing brands, retailers, importers, and wholesalers based in the U.S. and doing business globally, as well as our 2020 premier partner, PwC. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our presenters for the day. With us, we have Meiti Pereira, Managing Director of Customs and International Trade at PwC, and Kelly Pedersen, PwC Consumer Markets Managing Director. My name is Shannon Brady, Communications Coordinator at USFIA, and I will be your moderator. Please note that questions can be submitted at any time during the live program. Simply click on the question header on your webinar control panel, type your text into the box, and hit send. Our presenters will address as many questions as possible at the end of the program. If for some reason we experience a technical difficulty and lose audio, please refer to the chat box for further instructions. As a reminder, all registered participants will receive an email later today with a copy of the slide deck and a recording of today's session. And now, without further delay, I will hand the floor over to Kelly.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for joining. So again, my name is Kelly Peterson, and I lead our merchandising practice here at PwC. So really working with companies to optimize the spend on inventory and the spend on products. So today we thought we'd take a little bit of time just to talk about some of the things we've been hearing in light of the COVID crisis, and what some of the companies we've been working with and talking to are thinking about in terms of their inventory. And really, again, the premise is that obviously with shutdowns and general slowdown in business, apparel has been affected in a negative way, more than a lot of the other subsectors, as you know, in the industry, like grocery and even big box to a certain degree. And so it's gotten, apparel companies thinking more and more around what to do with the excess inventory that's been created as part of this. And so as we get into this, we've come up with a framework, almost a decision framework that we've been working with some companies on. And, it's really about balancing, optimizing, some of the pricing and promotion levers that are available, as well as, third-party sell-off to other channels, as well as wanted to bring a perspective on some of the duty implications and some potential benefits on the duty side. So really thinking about, the inventory and the merchandise holistically and end to end. So we can just flip the page and start getting into some of the content. Maybe the next page. Thank you. All right. So, this is just summarizing, some of the again, the things that, we've been hearing from a lot of the apparel fashion companies we work with. But, obviously a lot of companies are losing the prime spring selling season, and now that's even getting into the summer selling season. So, a lot of the concerns we've heard from the fashion companies is we've lost an entire almost 2 seasons, or at least a season and a half of selling. And we obviously have the inventory, on hand to be able to take advantage of that. And then we also have to think about all of the product coming in for future seasons. And it's really creating this backlog effect of inventory sitting idle. And, even though e-commerce is up for many, for a lot of apparel companies, even retailers, it still does only represent, 20% or often less of total sales. And so there is still a big significant impact in not only sales, but the amount of inventory that is building up. And then getting again to that second point, right, as new deliveries continue to happen, and many have canceled orders and have been relatively successful at that, or at least holding back some orders. But there still was a lot of product, either on the way or orders that couldn't necessarily be canceled. So there's still inventory building up. And companies also have to think about coming seasons, right? So spring is somewhat vanishing, and there's a question whether consumers will, once we stores open and get back to shopping, are they really going to be hungry for that spring product they missed, or are they going to be focusing on more summer, and then even in some cases, depending on when all of the retail opens up, we could be even getting into fall season. So, the third point here is really what we saw very initially in the market and continue to see is a lot of broad brush promotions. So, a lot of companies going 25% off everything, 30% off everything, or even 50 or 70 or 90%. And I think the result on the consumer side is obviously people are getting good deals, but there's also feeling of overwhelm with this promotion heavy environment, right? And so even though traditionally promotions like a 30% off would have had a pretty good effect in terms of driving incremental revenue, that may not be the case now because everything is at 30%. So almost what we felt is a general deflation of the price in the marketplace, which is having some interesting implications in terms of the effectiveness of some of these promotions that have happened. They just aren't as effective as they previously were. So what we've found a lot of retailers, apparel companies, it's focusing on is really turning that inventory into cash and not just looking at their traditional avenues that are available, but also being creative about finding ways to take this excess inventory and create cash and create some sort of value for it while the season has basically vanished. So some of the things we're going to talk about today are on the bottom here in terms of recommendations. And so again, I talked a little bit about the promotions and some of the markdowns and pricing actions. A lot of companies are taking, again, that broad brush approach. So, in the past, the 30% off everything sale is what we typically do at the end of the season. But many don't actually have advanced analytics behind what that will actually do to sales and generating extra profit from the products. And then, even if there are some analytics there, these are obviously unprecedented times. And again, that promotion heavy environment means some different things in terms of consumer behaviors. And so, some of the actions that companies may have taken on the product may not have the same effect. The second is to take, hard markdowns. So these are specific, markdowns on an item level basis. So, some items that have a shorter life cycle, many retailers may get more aggressive on, and some they may not get as aggressive on, depending if it's a longer season. The other part here I'll talk a little bit about in a couple of minutes is, being able to have the intelligence to take those down and really understand what will that mean at a location level. So not just taking a specific product chain wide off on markdown, but actually thinking about how stores are going to open, what the sequence is by store, by state, and being able to take markdowns on an individual store or zone or region basis, and putting some intelligence behind that. The third part is accurately identifying which inventory is at risk and taking action. So I think this has actually been a focus for a lot of the companies we talked to. This was one of their initial focuses, trying to cancel orders, trying to find other channels to push the inventory to. And we'll talk about it in a minute, but the traditional off-price channels of some of these big sell-off retailers aren't available to the full extent as they have been in the past. As I'm sure many of you read in the news how some of the big off-price players are not writing any more orders until June, July, and so it just creates another channel that's typically available to the apparel companies that won't be as available as it has previously. They're obviously still going to take some, but we've been hearing more and more that it's difficult to even push inventory through these off-price channels. And the last piece here is getting some duties back on excess merchandise. So this is definitely an option available to many companies, and it's actually something that can be quite lucrative. And so if inventory gets to a certain point where selling it off may not make economic sense, there could be other options available that Métis is going to talk about in terms of being able to get cash back on some of the duties that were paid. Okay, so if we can go to the next slide, please. And this page talks a little bit more about those options that we mentioned, right? So we use an example, but really wanted to highlight on here, at least four options that we've seen a lot of companies think about. On the top is the promotion and markdown, and I'm going to go into this a little bit more. But again, this is really about applying more analytics and more sophistication around deciding what those right promotion and markdown prices are going to be. So, we've been talking to a lot of companies and working with companies. We've got an optimization tool that we've been leveraging to add more intelligence into this and really give companies better insights to what the level of sales increase is going to be at various promotion and markdown levels, and then what just being able to help better predict what the end of season margin picture is going to look like, again at the various scenarios. So I'll walk through that a little bit more. The next option is B here is selling off to a discounter. So again, talk a little bit about that. You usually get pennies on the dollar, relative speaking, to what you can get at retail, but it is still a viable path that many companies take. I think the question here is just how much of those channels open up right now to apparel companies. There's certainly ways to sell product, but again, even there's even likely price deflation happening in that market as well, which makes C potentially a viable option for a lot of companies that, again, Métis going to talk about. But this is really about finding alternative ways to dispose of the product and collecting some duty that was paid previously on the products. And as we'll mention, I mean, in apparel it can be up to 35% of the cost of goods, so it can be pretty significant. And the fourth option D here, which we've definitely seen quite a few companies contemplate and act on, is holding the inventory. So if available, pack and hold it. Maybe some items that could live on beyond the spring summer season. Maybe it's even packing and holding them all the way until next spring and taking a smaller position and less deliveries on next spring. And so that's definitely an option. And we've worked with some companies on figuring out what the financial viability is of that, and even seeing within the warehouse, kind of the warehousing logistics market, that space is actually being gobbled up for some of these reasons. So this is definitely a viable option as well. But again, our offering has been helping companies think through these options and finding the most the most profitable, accretive way to dispose of the merchandise. And there might it might be a bit of a mix depending on the category or the product that is in excess. And so we've seen companies leverage all four of these, at the same company. So next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about the promo and markdown, just to get you an idea of some of the analytics that we've been working with companies on. The first scenario is really thinking about those class or subclass level promotions or even chain levels. So this is the example I initially talked about, is let's go 50% off everything as an example for a week or a period of time. And so, on this, you can basically see on the right-hand side is during the discount period, you're able to sell through a lot more inventory than you typically would have, which gets you at the end of the season, which we're showing as a week 11 here, week 12, to have more inventory than you would have if you hadn't offered those promotions. And so, as I mentioned, the analytical engine that we've been leveraging really helps predict what that end inventory picture would be if we took these various promotion levels. So, whether it's a 50% off, 70, 30% off, really being able to model those rather than just using, traditional, this is how we did it last year, so we're going to go 30% off everything. It's obviously an unprecedented world, and adding some more analytical horsepower to get more accurate about that, I think would make, obviously maximize the sales and the cash you're receiving for the inventory, but also, just give more assurance to where things are going to be at the end of the season. So next page, the next page gets on to the next scenario, which is, potentially looking at temporary price reductions, either at a style or a color level. So this is getting to that next level of detail. So, potentially for the, as stores ramp up and we want to generate some of that excess demand, we've seen companies think about these temporary price reductions. So, everything in this style category is going to be 30% off. So again, this is another scenario we model in our tool is, deciding what to do at that style level if we're going to do a temporary price increase, a one-time temporary price reduction, and what the impact of that would be on inventory. So next page. The third option is to take a more traditional markdown cycle, and so this could be a number of markdowns, and so this could be a cadence. So maybe for the first 2 weeks you're 20% off, and then you go at 40% off after that. And so the tool I mentioned that we use, the optimization tool, really goes and optimizes and recommends the right price to mark each individual item to at either a zone or a store level to maximize the margin dollars you're receiving for that product. So I think the interesting thing is many companies use markdown optimization tools that recommend the prices. The interesting thing now we're seeing is just the size of the markdown required to hit end inventory goals. And, obviously the reasons are a couple-fold. Is one, because demand is much lower than it typically is. So it takes longer to sell through that inventory, even at discounted prices. And then again, it just speaks, the other part is just the overall price deflation. So, a 70% off may not be as effective as it used to be in a non-promotional heavy environment. And so some of the recommendations we've been seeing and running through the optimization engine is definitely taking products down to a pretty drastic markdown, 70, 80, even 90% off recommended to get to the end inventory goals, which is why, again, this is not just a one lane highway when we think about these options and scenarios. Getting back to those four scenarios I talked about before, it's really about balancing those three and being able to run the right analytics to understand, if we took pricing action either at a category or style basis, what would that be and what would that get to? So the next few pages here, I'll hand it over to Métis, and she's going to talk a lot about the duty drawback piece. So next page, and Métis, you've got the floor.
Hey, thank you, Kelly, and good afternoon, everybody. As Kelly mentioned, duty drawback is an opportunity that we are seeing more and more companies explore as a means to mitigate the implications that they're experiencing in the context of the COVID crisis, which specifically with respect to their inventories and their bloated inventory levels, excuse me, and as they're looking at their traditional options for disposing of that inventory, as Kelly mentioned, many of the traditional options are not as attractive as they might historically have been in terms of, say, for example, in the context of off-price liquidators, because those avenues are also experiencing the same level of saturation of having all of the retailers across the country having the same experience or suffering the same circumstances. Those margins are being significantly impacted when they look at liquidating merchandise. So both the markdowns as well as the liquidations are happening at much deeper levels than historically have been the case, and in some cases putting that inventory in a loss position, where even the recovery that is resulting from a markdown sale or a liquidation sale is actually less than the inventory value of that product. Enter duty drawback, and specifically duty drawback in its current iteration. And we'll talk a little bit in a bit about the changes that have recently transpired within the duty drawback environment. But just to level set the concept for those of you who may not be familiar with duty drawback is a customs program that allows for the refund of up to 99% of the duties and taxes paid on imported merchandise where there is linkage to a subsequent exportation or destruction of comparable merchandise. And there are three sort of overarching types or categories of drawback that exist. There's unused merchandise drawback, there's manufacturing drawback, and now rejected merchandise drawback. As we've got a bit of an example here, just an illustration of how drawback works, and the level of flexibility that is inherent within drawback program. In our example, we've got 10 units of a shirt that are imported and 20 that are domestically sourced. So our inventory is of the same item is a commingled total of 300 units. And of those 300 units, we're going to have 8 that are sold in the U.S. and 15 that are exported in connection with either a sale or a transfer to another jurisdiction. And under duty drawback, those 15 that were exported are eligible to claim duty drawback on, notwithstanding that we don't necessarily have clear visibility to whether the ones that were imported or sourced domestically are the ones that were exported were exported. Now, that being said, if you'll remember, we had a total importation of 10 units. We are exporting 15 units. So our drawback potential is created by the duties and fees that were paid on the 10 units. We can only recover as much as we've paid, but it doesn't matter that the units that were exported may or may not be the ones that were imported. So just a little background on how the duty drawback program works. If we can move on to our next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the recent changes to the drawback program that have arisen as a result of TIFTIA and the new drawback regulations that were issued last year. Essentially, TIFTIA had the effect of creating much more simplicity in the drawback program and flexibility that didn't exist historically within duty drawback. Now it is much easier for companies to avail themselves of duty drawback and to do so in the context of potentially looking at a layered benefit. And we'll talk about that in a little bit further, but being able to take duty drawback, the benefit of duty drawback, and also combine it with some additional tax benefits that may be available. In terms of the old drawback rules, the drawback program has been around since 1789, so long-standing framework. Under the drawback rules, as I mentioned, there's a significant amount of restriction. The products specifically for direct identification drawback, which, as I mentioned, is one of the drawbacks one of the categories of drawback, you had to be able to demonstrate that the product that is exported is in fact the product that was imported. So you had to be able to have that direct match, both by colors, size, and part number, in order to be able to successfully claim duty drawback on that product. Now, under the new simplified drawback rules, that level of fungibility is not required specifically for substitution drawback. Now, for direct identification drawback, which is a drawback that is most generally used in the context of exports to the USMCA territory, historically the NAFTA territory. So when product is exported from the US to Canada and Mexico, direct identification drawback is what is available to us. However, when the exports are going to rest of world, there is no longer a need under the new simplified drawback rules to have that perfect matching between the product that was imported and the product that was exported. Now we can demonstrate fungibility in the imported product versus the exported product simply by being able to demonstrate that the tariff classification of the imported product and the exported product is the same at the 8 or 10 digit level. And we'll talk a little bit about a distinction between the 8 and the 10 digit level in a little bit, but that creates tremendous flexibility when in fact there's sourcing of different products, some from abroad and some being sourced domestically, and then what is being exported isn't necessarily what was previously imported, but could potentially be something that was sourced domestically, or rather that was sourced domestically and may have been imported by a domestic vendor. As long as we can demonstrate that we have the same 8-digit, or in some cases 10-digit tariff classification for the product that was imported and duty paid versus that which was exported, then we are able to successfully claim drawback and get those refunds. Other updates or changes that have been made by the change in the regulations has been the timing associated with duty drawback, particularly in the context of substitution drawback, where the timing, duty drawback has historically allowed for the imports and exports to happen within a look-back period of 5 years. Now that has been the case with respect to direct identification drawback, but for substitution drawback, where historically we were limited to a time period of 3 years, now we have the same 5-year look back for substitution drawback as well. So there again, that increases the potential for opportunity for companies to look at all of the duties that have been paid and identify the potential for duty drawback refunds. Finally, 2 other points with respect to the recovery of taxes and duties. It was very, very difficult to achieve, if not impossible, to achieve drawback on rejected merchandise. that the drawback refunds were only available for unused merchandise, and unused merchandise drawback and manufacturing drawback, which is something that is somewhat irrelevant for this audience. But now under the simplified drawback rules, we are able to recover those duties and taxes for both unused as well as rejected merchandise, which is the category of drawback that we can use for returned retail merchandise. And then finally, there's been a change on the basis of recovery under drawback, the new drawback regulations. Historically, the recovery was based on the unit of measure, and under the new regulations, the basis is the value, the lesser value calculation between the value of the imported product on which the duty was paid and the value of the exported product. And so with that background, maybe we can move on to the next slide and get into a little bit more detail about, particularly with respect to substitution drawback, which is where there has been the most significant change under the new regulations. Under substitution drawback, we are now able, as I mentioned, to demonstrate fungibility with respect to the imported and the exported product, simply by virtue of being able to demonstrate that we have the common tariff classification at the 8-digit level. Now, when we're referring to apparel products, there are some additional requirements, particularly in the context of direct identification, where there is still a requirement to match color and size. But we do have greater flexibility in the substitution space because as long as we can have just a identifier or a common identifier, that being the 8-digit HTS level or the 10-digit in some cases, that would be sufficient for us to be able to support a tariff, a duty drawback claim. And we can move on for a little bit more detail on this. Here we've presented sort of the substitution identification method in somewhat of a decision tree to demonstrate where the matching to demonstrate fungibility operates, where we have an 8-digit match. That is, we have two products, the imported product and the exported product, that are in fact classified under the same HTS level at the 8-digit level. If that 8-digit match is in a subheading that refers to product as other, so what we know as an other subheading, then under the new regulations, then we have to look at the 10-digit level in order to determine whether we can use the substitution drawback, because at the 8-digit level, we can only use substitution drawback if the 8-digit classification provision is not an other provision. If it's not an other provision, we can in fact confirm that we are eligible to use substitution drawback. If it is not, if we have an 8-digit subheading that is an other subheading, then we look to the 10-digit subheading. If at the 10-digit subheading we have products that do match, then at that point we can confirm that we can meet the requirements for substitution drawback and go forward with those claims. If, however, at the 10-digit level, we do not have a match, the products are not classifiable under the same 10-digit classification, then substitution would be disallowed, but it would still be possible to explore the possibility of direct identification drawback. Maybe we could move on to the next slide. Okay, we have a couple of examples here, just again taking us through how that substitution methodology operates. Here we have a product that was imported, a woman's skirt, wool skirt that was imported, and what is exported is a girl's wool skirt. We look to the 8-digit tariff classification for each of these two products, and we see that we have a match and that it is not a provision that is identified as other. Because the provision is not an other provision, and we've identified or confirmed the match at the 8-digit tariff classification level, then we can claim duty drawback upon the exportation of the girl's wool skirt, notwithstanding that what was imported was a woman's wool skirt. So that is an example of the 8-digit match where the 8-digit tariff classification is not an other tariff classification. Moving on to the next slide. Here we've got an example of substitution again, but in the context of where in fact the 8-digit match takes us to an other provision. So we have a men's shirt that was imported, and likewise a men's shirt that was exported. And we see that while we have an 8-digit match at 6205-3020, that 8-digit match is at an other provision. Because of the other provision, we cannot seek to use substitution at that 8-digit level. We have to look to the 10-digit provision that applies to each of these shirts. And looking to the 10-digit provision that applies to each of these shirts, it is the same 10-digit provision. By virtue of having that match at the 10-digit level, we can support a substitution drawback claim with respect to these products, notwithstanding that we have two very different products. So this is an example of the second scenario. We can move on to the third scenario. And here is the scenario where we look at the imported product being classified under a provision. The imported product is a woman's blouse. The exported product is a girl's blouse. The 8-digit tariff classification is a match. However, the 8-digit match is an other. So we know that we cannot use that level of match to support a substitution claim. We then look to the 10-digit match, and we see that at the 10-digit level, we do not have a match. Therefore, for purposes of substitution duty drawback, we would not be able to support a substitution drawback claim. However, direct identification might still be an opportunity in that scenario. And we can move on to our next slide. Returned retail merchandise is really an area for duty drawback that is new under the recent revisions to the regulations, and one that is extremely important for this industry because it was an area that was not available before. returned retail merchandise historically would not only not be subject to drawback because under the previous interpretation of the drawback regulations, once merchandise made it to a consumer, it was no longer unused. And by virtue of not being unused, it was no longer eligible for duty drawback. Now, with the introduction or the recognition of returned retail merchandise as eligible for rejected merchandise drawback, where there is merchandise that has made it to consumer channels, then that merchandise may still be eligible for duty drawback. The limitation with this particular category of merchandise, however, is that although the merchandise may be returned for any reason, and it doesn't matter that it has made it to the consumer and the consumer has taken it home and then come back and returned it, that's still fine. The only limitation is that whereas for unused, for direct identification and for substitution drawback, we had that 5-year period that I spoke of. In the rejected merchandise environment for returned retail merchandise, we are limited to a 1-year period from the date of exportation in order to claim the drawback. So altogether a new benefit that didn't exist prior to February of last year when the new regulations kicked in, and definitely a provision that gives a significant amount of opportunity in the retail sector where drawback had limited feasibility before. If we could move on to our next slide. Great. So one of the things that we have found in the current environment around duty drawback, and particularly for those industries like the consumer market and retail industry, where the duty drawback framework is typically inconsistent with the traditional model. The traditional model meaning that merchandise is imported with the intent of distribution in the United States, not necessarily certainly not for the intent of destruction, and not necessarily for the design of being exported. However, when we look at layering on the increase of e-commerce channels where many of the sales are not necessarily domestic sales, but there is a greater possibility that sales are happening abroad. E-commerce sales are happening abroad. If we layer that on top of the current COVID crisis, where inventories are bloated, and the U.S. in particular is still experiencing the shutdowns, whereas other jurisdictions are starting to come out of the crisis and starting to open up and restart their economies. There might be an opportunity to redirect inventories from the US, where they were originally intended, to perhaps other jurisdictions where those markets might be opening up. The other opportunity in maximizing duty drawback that we've seen is looking at directed dispositions of these inventories. And by directed dispositions, what I mean is that we have seen companies that have, instead of looking at liquidation channels that are domestic, that are maybe their traditional liquidation channels, they've identified opportunities to explore foreign liquidation channels, or rather directed liquidation channels where the liquidator, as part of the agreement, agrees that the merchandise must be exported. And that requirement for exportation is in fact part of the negotiation, such that not only is there, at that point, are you able to recover whatever the liquidation value is of that good, but because that liquidation results in an exportation, we can then layer on the benefit of duty drawback. And in instances, we have seen that when we layer on the benefit of a directed liquidation, where perhaps that liquidation is at a more discounted rate than the liquidation options that are traditionally available in the United States. However, when we layer on the duty drawback refund to that discounted liquidation rate, it actually exceeds the cash potential of the liquidation, the US liquidation alone. Likewise, we've seen the same in the context of donations. Whereas many companies are looking at donating some of their excess inventory, if and that donation of inventory may in fact allow them to avail themselves of a charitable donation tax benefit. If that donation can be effected in a directed way, such that part of the agreement for that donation is that that merchandise must be exported. That is how it must be, how the charitable organization that receives the donation must dispose of the merchandise, has to be outside of the United States. Then we have the opportunity of layering on both the charitable donation tax benefit as well as the duty drawback benefit. And then an offshoot of that is also in the context of destructions. As I mentioned early on, duty drawback can be obtained not only when there is a subsequent exportation, but also if there is a destruction. And for many companies where their brand is pivotal, the liquidation channels are not as attractive as perhaps they might otherwise be, because of the value of the brand. And certainly severe liquidation can have significant dilution impacts on the brands. So for those companies, we're seeing the ability to, in the current COVID environment, taking the opportunity to destroy that merchandise, those inventories. It allows the duty drawback refund benefit. It may be possible to obtain a disaster loss benefit in the context of the current COVID environment, which is something that wouldn't necessarily be available in our traditional models. And it is protecting the brand. So that is 3 avenues of benefit that can be layered on to achieve an optimized result for the disposition of those products, that we're seeing be very significant in the current environment. That is so unique. We've never had a situation where all of the 50 states have been in a declared state of emergency, of disaster at the same time. So tremendous power to the ability of layering various different benefits to optimize the cash value of those inventories. And then on top of that, what we've seen be very, very successful is leveraging automation particularly for purposes of substitution drawback, so that we can match or we can identify through the automated tools that have been that we've developed, allow for the best match between the value of the import and the duties and the taxes that have been paid on that import against the products that are subject to export or destruction, so that we can get to the maximum percentage of that import. That has also changed the equation from the drawback perspective significantly, in that we have seen instances where under a traditional model where duty drawback was done sort of just by mapping imports to exports without any design behind it, without any of the automated intelligence, whereas the benefit has been X. When we introduce the automated intelligence for matching, the optimization tools that we have identified, we have seen that benefit grow exponentially, in some instances by over 250%, simply by virtue of the matching optimization that we've done. I think we can move on to our next page. And with that, I can turn it back to Kelly to take us home with some closing thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Meiti. So, as we've been talking about, there's obviously, a few different options for companies to consider. Again, to maximize the cash value of the inventory, and obviously there's there's sort of the methodologies, but underlying that, is where we've been working a lot with companies to do this, because we've got a suite of tools, whether it's as Meiti was talking about, some optimization and being able to understand the impact and potential impact of duty drawbacks, to running optimization on various pricing and markdown scenarios, to even getting more visibility into what inventory is inbound, and what do we need to divert. So just wanted to close with the fact that there's obviously tools, whether it's ours or others out there, to really accelerate these, and I think now is more than the time to ever to really apply some of these more advanced analytics onto inventory, rather than just taking a gut feel approach. So that concludes the presentation, and so I think we wanted to open it up to Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much, Meiti and Kelly. We are now going to turn the floor over to our audience for questions. We'll start with those submitted during the live presentation. We encourage all attendees to continue submitting questions using your dashboard. And the first question we have is, how can we prove to customs concerning the unused merchandise? What do we have to do with that merchandise in order to get duty drawback?
Certainly. Great question. Duty drawback is really predicated on the ability of documentation and evidence that essentially traces the life cycle of that product. So from the import perspective, we have to be able to show the product being imported, the duty being paid. Obviously, that generally is not a problem. But then we need to be able to demonstrate that merchandise coming into being receipted into inventory in the US, its life cycle in inventory, and then to the extent that it's the same product being exported in the context of direct ID, then we have to be able to show that inventory, that product coming out of inventory being picked to either go into an order or to a shipment to a client, to a customer, if we were talking about a customer sales, or a transfer. We have to be able to demonstrate, either through documentation or through systems records that the merchandise was imported, that it was in fact received into inventory, and that it or comparable merchandise was exported or destroyed. And everything on the export side, we really take it all the way to be able to proving the export, demonstrating to customs that we have exported that product by in some instances providing the shipping information for that export transaction.
Great, thank you. And sticking with the topic of duty drawback, how quickly can drawback refunds be received?
Sure, another good question. So duty drawback, when claims are put in, it is possible for the drawback claimant to request or file an application for accelerated payment. So that can be part of the request or the application, the drawback application process to customs at the outset. Once a application for accelerated payment is approved by customs, generally for purposes of approval of an accelerated payment application, customs will require that the drawback claimant file a drawback bond. The drawback bond essentially provides assurance that that if for some reason the drawback refund is paid to the claimant and at a later date it is determined that it was paid in error, customs has a area of recourse to get those duties back. But under an accelerated payment process, the drawback claimant can get paid in as little as 4 to 6 weeks.
Great, thank you, Métis. And as a follow-up to the first question, do you have any insights on how companies can document that merchandise was destroyed?
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that is most compelling to customs, there's always the opportunity, if we're talking about prospective destructions, that means the product has not been destroyed yet, then it is possible to approach customs and advise of the intent of filing a drawback claim, and giving them give customs the opportunity to witness the destruction. And that obviously it provides the greatest evidence of destruction, because either customs will determine that it wants to witness the destruction, and in some cases I have seen customs actually go out and witness a destruction, or say that they waive their right to witness, and will be satisfied by a certificate of destruction issued by an appropriate destruction or cartage company. The certificate of destruction is typically the most traditional, the most typical evidence of destruction that we see. There is one of the challenges that we see sometimes in certificates of destruction is that there isn't the requisite amount of detail listed in the supporting documentation for that certificate of destruction. What customs wants to see, and what we would encourage, is that there be a very detailed itemization of all of the product that is covered in that shipment that is going to be destroyed, and the service provider, the cartage company, or the company that is going to undertake the destruction, sign off on that very detailed listing. as opposed to, say, for example, I've seen certificates of destruction that will simply say that they picked up a shipment, or that they will give the weight of the shipment. Those identifiers are typically insufficient for customs. We want to have detail as to what was comprised in that shipment.
Great, thank you, Métis. This next question is directed at Kelly. Kelly, you touched on a number of strategies companies can employ for inventory optimization. Do these strategies apply to merchandise with longer life cycles, or are they purely for products with shorter lifestyles like apparel?
Yeah, sure. So it definitely can apply to both, and I think when we do this type of analysis, typically that is a part of it. Just understanding, of course, that goods that have a longer life cycle have a better chance of selling in the future, and so that's where we see a lot of companies, rather than take individual markdown approach, really look at options to find alternate holding or distribution methods for some of those products. And so it's something that, in terms of the analytical models, they definitely consider. We just generally find that the recommendations are more geared towards potentially holding on to that product, or doing some broader temporary price reductions that I walked through, rather than fully marking, taking a hard markdown on the product. So that's just a couple examples.
Great, thank you. And before we conclude today's webinar, I just wanted to ask if either of you had any final recommendations for brands and retailers.
I can go first. Yeah, I would say I would recommend that everybody look at duty drawback and the potential to layer on the additional benefits that may be available in the current environment by virtue of the COVID crisis, when they're considering the disposition, the most appropriate disposition of the bloated inventories. I've heard clients tell me, duty drawback is not in our model. It's not consistent with our model. And while I certainly appreciate that, the current environment is inconsistent with everybody's model. It creates a unique set of circumstances that really require us to look at opportunities to help to create liquidity for the companies. And by being able to look at the benefits of duty drawback when we're layering on the potential for things like the tax benefit associated with either a disaster loss or a targeted donation that results in an exportation, and we get the charitable deduction, the ability to take a charitable deduction benefit, that can create a very compelling result that, albeit not consistent with our usual model, can create significant benefit for the organization.
Yeah, and I think, just to add to that, I mean, I agree. I think one of the concepts there is, in normal times, right, decisions around inventory often happen, between one or two departments, whether it's like merchandising or planning. Obviously finance often gets involved, but more and more, some of the companies we've worked with is it's really about bringing more, I guess, non-traditional functions to the table when talking about the options of inventory. So, again, duty and where that may lay, whether it's customs or within the tax group, now more than ever is really time to bring more of that real cross-functional kind of roundtable approach to all of the options available to, again, create cash from the inventory that could be accessed right now.
Great, thank you. And thank you again, Métis and Kelly, for speaking today. On that note, we are going to conclude today's webinar. Just as a quick reminder to attendees, you will receive a follow-up email containing the slide deck and recording from today's program. Please don't hesitate to reach out with any additional questions. You can always contact USFIA directly by emailing us at info@usfashionindustry.com. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to hosting you at the next USFIA event.